During the middle of the 18th century, before the American Revolution, about 1 in 3 young women who went down the aisle to marry did so while pregnant. This information comes from court and parish records that have been kept. This rate doesn't change much from one colony to the next, whether it's Puritan New England, Quaker Philadelphia, or fancy Charleston. England, which is appropriately called Mother Country, had almost half of its brides pregnant when they got married. In colonial times, marriage was often seen as a business deal, and matches were often made based on the future husband's wealth, social status, and ability to make money. The arrangers thought that love would come after everything else, if it ever did. Being married meant that both you and your spouse had responsibilities to each other and to the community as a whole. There wasn't much chance that these attitudes would win against people's feelings and natural tendencies. While formal courtship, engagement, and marriage did happen, and parents whose kids were old enough to get married definitely wanted them to, the road was often missed because of hormonal changes and being close by. Large American towns that were all seaports had a booming sex industry that added to the busyness of daily life and the high rates of venereal disease. The pulpits were now raging against having sex without permission or before marriage. Sexual crimes and cheating came with harsh punishments, but the promises of love and pleasure often made people more willing to risk punishment. People in colonial America often had the wrong idea about sex because it was covered in myths, and people believed in a false morality. In colonial America, people did and said these 10 different kinds of sexual things. Bedboards. Aside from along the coast, where rough roads and rivers linked the eastern towns, getting around in the colonies was hard and took a lot of time. Because the weather affected the roads that were there, a good day for travel could quickly turn into a day of slogging through mud. For many, the town where their ancestors had lived was only a few miles away from where they were born, grew up, and lived their whole lives. The people they knew were the ones who lived there with them. Family members or other visitors, usually traders and hunters, would visit from time to time. In colonial America, most women were thought to be old enough to start courting when they were 15 or 16, but most didn't get married until they were in their 20s. In almost all towns, young men who wanted to call on young women had to get permission from the girl's parents first. The girl's parents had different rules about who could call on their daughters. Key things were property and possibilities. Young men who didn't have either, at least in the eyes of the father, often seemed eager to steal a girl they had probably known their whole lives. They sometimes won, but most of the time, the daughter was forced to marry someone she didn't want to. In many places, whether the match was planned or spontaneous, it was common for the young pair to go through certain steps during their courtship. One of these was to see if they could live together. When people lived together, they slept together. Because of the long, cold winter nights and wood-burning fires that kept homes warm, the shared bed was both a place to rest or do something else. Throughout the colonies, when a courtship seemed to have hit a point where it was necessary, a test drive for marriage was set up. The young man would spend the night at his girlfriend's house, sleeping in her bed while her parents slept in a different room. He did this to see if the two of them would get along at night. There were rules, mostly that they couldn't touch. And to make sure they followed them, the bed had a board put on its edge across the middle to keep the two kids apart. The board was less than a foot wide most of the time. It would have been a very dangerous couple of teens who couldn't get over the board in that situation. One has to wonder how many courtships ended and wedding dates were pushed up after a boarding night. Boarding with more than one boyfriend was frowned upon by society, and it happened right before an engagement was officially revealed. Bundling. It's possible that the Dutch brought bundling to the American colonies. It had been done for a long time in the Low Countries, and it did very well in Pennsylvania and New York during colonial times. It was kind of like boarding, but instead of separating a couple who were dating, bundling brought them closer together while theoretically stopping them from having sexual contact. Bundling was so common that it was sometimes done in inns so that strangers could share a bed without worrying that rude behavior would wake them up in the middle of the night. This let innkeepers charge extra for half a bed, which helped them make more money without having to build more rooms. Some people think that rapping came from the Bible, specifically the story of Ruth and Boaz. This is true for many colonial customs, but the story in the book of Ruth doesn't say that Ruth and Boaz were tied together. It only says that Ruth slept at his feet on the floor of a threshing room while wearing his blanket. It looks like the religious link was added after the fact to help Puritans in New England understand why the practice was okay. The practice may have also grown because of the distance between homes and how hard it was to get from one to the other. A trip through New England or New York at night in the winter could be dangerous, since it gets dark early in the winter. Many conservative pastors were against the practice and preached against it whenever people in the community knew it was going to happen, which, in smaller towns, was news. Jonathan Edwards and a lot of other Puritan preachers were against the practice because the couple was made into a sack together. They could have some sexual contact. The mother or older sister of the young woman in the bundle would sew a line between them so they couldn't fully touch. Of the time, it happened at the woman's house, and her parents knew about it and took part. The couple was locked up together all night and would be freed in the morning. The couple probably told a lot of private things to each other because of it, and their parents probably got mad. Bundling and boarding were both seen as good for the community because strong, healthy marriages were thought to be the foundation of community life. In the bigger coastal places, like Boston and Portsmouth, they were done less often, but still in some. When someone was married off through an arranged marriage, it was possible to build a bond with the promised couple that wouldn't have been possible in colonial society, where chaperones were common at public events. Arranged marriage. Most people think that women got married a lot younger in colonial America than they do now. In general, this isn't true, but there were some who got married very young. There were still a lot of arranged marriages. Some women were guaranteed marriage when they were still in their mid-teens, but the wedding was usually put off until a better age. In negotiations about marriage, women were often offered property as part of the marriage. This was especially true as the colony's wealth-based class system became more rigid. In the upper class, young men and women were expected to marry someone with money, a good name, and real estate. This made it hard for guys who wanted to get married. A lot of the time, the oldest son got the property. The younger boys usually got smaller estates or less money to build their own. But the oldest had problems with this system, too. He had to wait for his father to give out his money before he could go to the table with his potential in-laws and negotiate. The system often made it hard for the couple to decide if they were getting married because they loved each other or because it was an arrangement. Because people are naturally curious, one or both of the people in a marriage set up by the parents often became interested in other people beyond the agreement. It was very likely that someone would do something sexually inappropriate. George William Fairfax and Sally Carey got married in Virginia. Their parents set up the marriage. George Washington's first true love was Sally, and there is proof that she felt the same way about him. She stayed true to her husband, though. Sally's father thought George Washington was not as important as the Carey family because his older half-brother Lawrence was the owner to the Washington family's wealth and lands. Landowning families in Virginia often went through these kinds of fine details when setting up marriages. This probably added to the high number of duelings that happened at the time. The man wasn't the only one who had to bring something valuable to the marriage talks. A gift had to be given by the bride's family. Guys from the upper classes had to be very careful when their girls chose a suitor on their own. This was especially true if the man was from another area and not well known, like an English visitor. Before, arranged marriages kept their girls from being taken by the shady son of an English nobleman who was hiding in America from debtors and wanted to marry into money. Common law. Marriage. Most states no longer recognize common law marriage, but it was popular in England and the English colonies in North America. They were mostly for lower class people, but not only them, common law weddings. They were just married, with no help from a priest or judge. When two people get married, the husband gets control of the wife's property and can do what he wants with it. People who got married under common law usually didn't talk about property when they got married. People still think that living together for a set amount of time is the same thing as common law marriage. This isn't always the case, and it wasn't always the case in the colonies when people got married under the common law, which came from England. Under common law, you had to make a declaration of purpose in order to get married. One reason they were so popular in England was that they didn't need any written paperwork, like a license. They were recognized without having to pay a tax to the government or a fee to the church. In many towns, parish registries were the most accurate way to keep track of people living in the area. They kept records of common law marriages and the babies that came from them. The middle class didn't have a lot of shame. Even though upper-class people who got married under the law to avoid an unwelcome marriage set up by their parents or guardians might have been looked down upon by their peers. Couples from the gentility often did it when love was stronger than money or social norms. The two people did a procedure called a spousal contract to become married under common law. In the southern states, like Virginia, the ceremony was called hand fasting. They held hands and said vows that were very similar to modern ones that they picked for themselves. If there was no witness, they could still say their vows as long as both of them swore under oath that they had done it. This way, if someone later questioned them, like the angry father of the bride, they would have proof that they had done it. For common law marriage to work, there had to be an oral contract of marriage. Most church and state authorities in the colonies accepted it as legal, but the Roman Catholic Church did not. There was also a legal contract for a future marriage. If the pair who signed it had a child before the wedding date, they were automatically married according to the terms of the future marriage contract. Again, verbal agreements were fine, but many working-class women had a friend or sister listen in as the promises were made so that they would be carried out if the man tried to avoid his duties. The Scarlet Letter. There were rules about sexual behavior in the early colonies. Some of these laws covered the marriage bed, though they were not always strictly enforced when acts were done by married couples. There is a good chance that most of these rules came straight from the Book of Leviticus in the King James Version of the Bible. In Plymouth Colony, a man was put on death row for the crime of bestiality, which he admitted to. The animals involved were killed in front of him while he was put to death. When deciding his sentence, the court used a quote from Leviticus: "If a man lies with a beast, he will surely be put to death, and you shall kill the beast." Sexual crimes that were thought to be less serious were still dealt with by the courts, which followed the rules set out in the Bible. The Bible was a big part of the sex laws that developed in New England. This is because the founders of the first New England colony wrote about their goal in their first law, called the Mayflower Compact. In that way, they both agreed that they had come to the New World for God's glory and the advancement of the Christian faith. Even though Leviticus says that people who commit incest, adultery, sodomy, or almost any other sexual act that isn't allowed by marriage between a husband and wife should be put to death, kindness often won out, and lighter sentences were given. As a message to the rest of the community, punishments were meant to be humiliating for the person who was punished. People often got whipped or put in the stocks for a while a sign explained what they had done wrong. Both in court and from the church, punishments were given out. In court papers, one married woman did what was called the act of uncleanness with an Indian man named Tinson. She was to be beaten while being pulled through town on an ox cart by a rope. Also, she had to wear a badge on her shirt that said what crime she had committed every time she went out in public. If anyone saw her in public without the tag, they would mark the symbol on her cheek. Because Tinson had been enticed into his crime, the court decided that his sentence should not be too harsh. He was whipped in public while being tied to a post by a neck halter. Sexual activity before marriage was clear and punished as well. Premature birth of the first child was proof of incontinency before marriage, and since the proof came from God, the right sentence had to be given. The husband was usually beaten, and the wife, who was now a mother, was usually put in the stocks as a punishment. People who did sexual acts were punished less harshly as New England grew, but the rules stayed in place until the state constitutions were written during the Revolutionary War. It was also the source of many of the new rules. Prostitution. Even though the border between the colonies was only a few hundred miles from the coast, the hinterlands had to be self-governed. The colonial government's main job was to collect taxes and rents and stop Indian attacks. There wasn't much prostitution in these smaller towns because everyone knew everyone else and most people didn't like it when that happened. But it was real. The small city of Williamsburg was right next to York County, Virginia, but the county was mostly rural. The grand jury met twice a year and charges of prostitution were frequent. Fornication was generally the crime that women who worked as prostitutes were charged with, and common punishments were fines and public whippings on her bareback laid well on. Of course, the court didn't think it was inappropriate to spank a semi-naked woman in public. There were complaints in some areas about inns and taverns that were running as disorderly houses, which was a term that sometimes meant a bordello. The records show that these places were fined for breaking the law. The bigger places in America were on the coasts, and they ran ports. The seaports became busy hubs for trade, and sailors from other American towns and all over the world often came to stay in the coastal towns. This was because British ships were often staffed by men of all races and nations. Even in Boston, which was still very religious, there was a thriving business in prostitution in the towns. Since there were no police vice squads, moral authority had to enforce the rules. Churches asked people for information about prostitutes that they could give to the police. The fact that there were brothels in all of the bigger towns wasn't a secret. At that time, Philadelphia was the biggest city in the United States. A part of the city was called Helltown. There were a few prostitutes there, and while the idea of putting a red light on them hadn't caught on yet, it wasn't hard to figure out where they were from people who had been there before. Some brothels were only for the classier people in Philadelphia. They were places where people could be discreet, play cards, drink good wine, and be sure that the women who worked there didn't have any sexually transmitted diseases. People on foot walked along the streets near the warehouses and wharves where they could do business quickly in a dark lane or corner. Often, they were joined in secret by other people who would rob her customer of any money he had left over before throwing him into the water. People who lived on the streets and sailors who moved around a lot spread sexual diseases in the colonies, especially syphilis, which was known as the Great Pox. Birth control. The ongoing heated discussion in America about abortion did not exist in the colonies before the Revolution or even before the 1800s. A lot of people are surprised that this isn't because abortion wasn't around yet, because there were no rules against abortion. Abortion was easy to get in the colonies, pretty safe compared to what doctors knew and did at the time, and allowed until the mother felt her baby kick for the first time, which is called quickening. Even though some people have lied about the past of abortion, the proof that it was legal and easy to get in colonial America is there for anyone who wants to know the truth. It was so normal for people to have sex before or after marriage that the punishments for it got lighter over time. By the late 1700s, it wasn't punished at all. The number of so-called premature births, which were around 40% during the colonial era, shows that people were having sex before they got married as early as the Pilgrim days in Plymouth Colony. The Puritans agreed with English law and practice that abortion was legal up to the point of quickening, which they saw as the start of life. During the colonial era, most babies were born with the help of midwives. They were much more common than doctors and generally better at giving birth. It was also known to these midwives how to get an abortion, which was generally done with herbal potions. Abortions by surgery were very rare and dangerous. At that time, all surgeries were risky because of how often people got infections afterward. During colonial America, there was also no shame for women who decided to end their pregnancy by having an abortion. In early America, communities valued strong, healthy families. However, they also knew that families that couldn't take care of themselves could be a burden on the society. In these places, abortions were openly done and didn't raise any eyebrows. The midwife was seen as a valued part of the community, not as an outsider. There were other ways to prevent births, but none of them worked very well because the colonies had some of the highest birth rates in the Western world. In colonial America, abortion wasn't a problem. It was mostly done as a way to avoid having children, not because it was medically necessary, because medicine wasn't advanced enough to know most of the risks that came with some pregnancies. In any of the former colonies, rules about abortion did not become law until the early 1800s after the War of 1812. Pornography. In the American colonies, there was a lot of pornographic literature, plays, and songs. What was called pornographic back then was different from what it is today. There weren't many laws that directly mentioned the word, which kept some researchers from noticing that it was there. This kind of wording was used in the colonies to talk about what we now call pornographic. Words like lewd, lascivious, immoral, lustful, wanton, and others were used to describe it. Benjamin Franklin liked it and used it in his works and cartoons, often hiding it in drawings or what we would now call graphics. The clergy spoke out against it from the pulpits, saying that people who watched pornographic materials would go on to break even more important laws, like masturbating, which was seen as wrong and illegal. A young man from Springfield, Massachusetts, called Samuel Terry, was fined and given lashes after being caught behind the churchyard, chafing his yard to provoke lust. He did this because he was having sexy thoughts because of hearing inappropriate speech. Native American customs and behaviors were also twisted by writers who wanted to get their readers excited. For example, they wrote about husbands living with multiple wives in the same house and having sexual encounters with each other. Wives were also traded back and forth between men in the tribe. People often said that these stories came from the journals of French preachers who lived with the Indians. They were used to make the Indians look even worse by calling them savages, who behaved sexually like wild animals, even though the behavior was shown in very graphic detail. There was also pornographic writing in the form of letters and pamphlets that talked about the breeding sheds on southern farms, where women were raped by men chosen by the master to have children. During the early stages of the anti-slavery movement, these were made for men in the North to enjoy. They contained both pornography and anti-slavery messaging. Before the Revolutionary War, slavery was already causing trouble and discussion in the colonies, but pornography was not. Homosexuality. The fact that laws were made against homosexuality and people were punished by the courts for breaking them shows that it was common in the early towns of the colonies. In 1636, Plymouth Colony passed laws that made it illegal for homosexuals to meet with each other, with harsh punishments. In 1650, Connecticut passed rules that were similar, but had even harsher penalties. It is clear from the records of both countries that people were punished for breaking the law, but the punishments got lighter over time. As time goes on, this could mean that the Puritans and other groups have become more open-minded. It could also be a mirror of the times, when the colonies were short-staffed as they grew and needed healthy workers more than they needed to punish people for wrongdoing. It could also mean that judges didn't want to give harsh punishments for a crime that had become common, like they did for having sex before marriage and other crimes that clogged up the courts with cases. The settlement of Rhode Island, which used to be called Providence Settlement, called sodomy a vile act. These men have given up the natural use of women and are burning with lust for each other, so men work together to do what is wrong. Except for the New Haven colony, which became part of Connecticut, none of the colonies had rules or interpretations of the book of Leviticus that talked about women. The laws and punishments were based on that book. By the end of the colonial era, all of the colonies had laws against sodomy. Some of these laws said that both men and women were guilty, and most of the time, the courts in all of the colonies had greatly lowered the punishments for sodomy, even though the laws said that the punishment was death. But people's views changed as time went on. During the American Revolution, a man who was known for acting homosexually was in France looking for a job with the American Army. At the same time, he was being prosecuted for sodomy under one of Germany's harsh laws. Name of the man was Baron Wilhelm von Steuben. Benjamin Franklin was in Paris at the time and knew about the charges and how likely they were to be true. Franklin also knew how good von Steuben was as a soldier and how useful he would be to Washington's still unskilled American army. Even though Franklin knew von Steuben was gay, he chose to ignore it and wrote notes recommending him to Congress and Washington. Venereal disease. In colonial America, getting sick was dangerous. All of the colonies often had outbreaks of smallpox, typhus, cholera, malaria, scarlet fever, and other diseases. There was also syphilis that was almost an outbreak. Columbus brought syphilis back to the Old World, but some people don't agree on whether that was the first time the disease came to Europe. It was definitely common among the American Indians, and it quickly spread to the people in the colonies. It was called the Great Pox, or just the pox. The English mother country saw the colonies as an alternative to keeping criminals in jails, which would cost the state money. There were no health restrictions that would stop convicted prostitutes from being sent to the colonies to work as indentured slaves. The same went for their customers, who could also get venereal diseases from working with them. As a result, the colonies kept bringing in people who were syphilitic as they grew. People in the colonies were afraid of syphilis because it could make people look bad and hurt them. As early as the late 1760s, just before the actions that would lead to war with England and freedom, syphilis and other venereal diseases were spreading like wildfire. As they do now, they needed sexual contact with multiple partners to spread. The fact that venereal diseases were common in the English regions of North America is enough to show that people were sexual. By 1760, their spread was a big concern for doctors, who couldn't do much about it because they didn't know what caused it and didn't have the right tools to stop it. By the 1770s, ads were showing up in newspapers and broadsheets all over the colonies, in almost every city in Massachusetts, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, and all the way down to Georgia. These ads gave the addresses of doctors who had studied the sexually transmitted diseases that were becoming very common and said they knew how to fix them. Apothecaries also promoted the sale of medicines that could help people with diseases. As it turned out, the drugs didn't do much more than ease the symptoms, and the doctors couldn't cure the disease without antibiotics. Venereal diseases that started in the colonies spread across North and South America. By the time the U.S. joined the Second World War, syphilis was the fourth most common cause of death in the U.S. Today, STDs are still very common all over the country. Another reason to understand that colonists' sexual habits were not that different from ours today is venereal disease. We hope you like this video, subscribe to the channel if you're a history addict, and please let us know about what civilization or time period we should talk about. Also, watch another video here.